Hello again. I'm Jeffrey K. Mondello, editor of the Boston Catholic Journal. Today, I would like to explore Ecumenism, understood as the new religion of the Post-Catholic-Conciliar-church. Christ will one day return. Yes, imagine, even in this cesspool of human and diabolical misery that we proudly, even defiantly, call the postmodern world, where the only ethic is the abolition of every ethic. That is to say, the calculated repudiation of truth as the vertex of all moral authority. Of course, we can stand as Pilate did and ask with feigned ignorance, what is truth? Even as Pilate stood before truth itself, that is to say, Christ, and then go on to crucify it. In fact, we have. But why? Why this renunciation of Christ as absolutely singular and indispensable to salvation, such that St. Paul unequivocally declares, "Neither is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given to men whereby we must be saved." Note that St. Paul does not say can be saved, but must be saved. The answer is strikingly simple. The centrality and indispensability of Christ is an impediment to something deemed greater than truth itself, which, since Vatican II, has been the ecumenical project, perhaps best understood as religious neutrality. In ecumenism, it is absolutely vital for us to understand all religions, however absurd, illogical, and in manifest contradiction to every other religion, are not just correct, but are in fact, in a way that defies reason and logic, to say nothing of divine revelation, equally true expressions of the one true religion, which only becomes understandable when we realize that ecumenism is the unreserved affirmation of all religions. No one religion is correct or true. All are true. All are correct. Such a statement, of course, is logically absurd. It is a statement in violation of the law of non-contradiction in logic, which tells us in very simple terms that one and the same thing cannot both be and not be at one and the same time in a univocal sense, that is to say, in the same sense, without resulting in irreconcilable contradiction. It cannot both be and not be in the same sense at the same time without invoking contradiction. In fact, it's a necessary and inviolable function of human understanding. Now, I hasten to add, and I hope needlessly, that this is not Catholicism, but a different religion altogether, which had been spuriously inserted into and then clandestinely, that is to say, deliberately and deceptively, conflated with Catholicism for over 60 years by, hard as it may be to swallow, every Vatican II Pope since John the 23rd. Think on that. But it is under Francis that ecumenism as a distinct religion, as a mature spiritual pathogen, came to full culture within the Church. Francis brought what had been carefully cultivated by all the post-conciliar popes to full term. And now it has emerged as a phenomenon of itself, having no distinct creed and in need of no doxological credentials, as the now distinct religion which we have come to call ecumenism. Consider the following statement which Francis proclaimed to the plenary session of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity on the 5th of May 2022. I quote, "I would like to emphasize that today, for a Christian, it is not possible or practicable to go alone with one's own denomination. Either we go together, all the fraternal denominations, or we do not go ahead at all. Alone, never. We cannot do it. Today, either we all walk together, or we do not walk." End quote. This is Francis. This is also madness. It is heresy, and possibly apostasy. It is unquestionably contrary to the Catholic faith as it has been known, understood, and practiced for the 2 millennia preceding that calamitous council we call Vatican II, and the disastrous oracle of Francis within the Church. What Francis just stated is an affront not only to traditional Catholics, but to the universal human capacity to reason and understand in coherent and consistent terms. Do you not see this? In ecumenism, we confront the illogical, the emotive, the intractable unwillingness to engage in anything construed as possibly inimical to its own peculiar agenda. Any attempt to invoke the canons of reason are understood as a threat to the ecumenical project, which indeed they are. For this reason, we insist that Francis is not simply the culmination, but the personification of the failed logic of that malignant enterprise, a pantheistic project, really, benignly dubbed ecumenism. Since Vatican II, reason, logic, and revelation have been effectively abolished. Ecumenism, not Christ, is the apex, the summit of every religious aspiration and impulse. Who then is the true God? We see this clearly in the 3 inter-faith-assemblies initiated by 3 successive popes in Assisi, John Paul II on October 26, 1986. Then also on January 2002, his next pan-religious prayer meeting in the same venue. This was to be followed by, Benedict XVI's meeting for peace on October 27th in 2011. And then, of course, Francis's Day of Prayer for Peace in Assisi, Italy, once again, on September 20th, 2016. On these occasions, the absence of certainty concerning the one true God was the absolutely indispensable element for the merest possibility of ecumenism. Praying to Islam's Allah, Shinto's Kami, Hindu's Trimurti, the Zoroastrian Ahura Mazda, the African animist snake Dan, God snake Dan, or the Buddhist Dalai Lama, who possesses no fewer than 108 avatars, was, in a quite uncertain way, praying to the same God in a kind of iridescent cope. Each iteration of God, each God of each religion, was respectively acclaimed the certain God, even while it was impossible to reconcile all the alternating perceptions and contradictions inherent in the claims of the various religions. In fact, the Catholics were the only faction in the pantheon of contradictory gods who, through the very man who sits on the very seat of St. Peter himself, Jorge Bergoglio, the Catholics were the only who stated that they, at least, were uncertain, and quite uncertain about the identity of the true God, and held the least tenable position of all, that the contradictions were only and ultimately illusory in the ecumenical schema. Those brazen enough to insinuate the faculty of reason into the ecumenical paradox, and who raised the objection that the contradictions were real, both baffled and infuriated the progressive Catholic ecumenist, who could, of course, resolve these otherwise insuperable issues in the snap of a chat. It is a strange, recursive world completely apart from the world of men, and its epicenter is the Vatican. It is a world that expropriates madness from the narrow halls of the insane asylum, not only as emblematic of, but necessary to, the absurdity encountered at every level of higher authority and higher learning within the Church, and most especially the Vatican and Francis as Pope. This mantra, the certainty of uncertainty, except the irrational notion of the uncertainty of certainty. Chew on that one for a while. Appears to verge on something intelligible until one examines it more closely. Let's look at it. Of this alone, we are certain. The certainty of the uncertain. Except, of course, the certainty of uncertainty. For of this we are quite certain. The religious epicenter, I should say, of this mental illness, as we have said, is the Post-Catholic Vatican II, and its primary sponsor, Francis, who infects with faux Jesuitical casuistry everyone in proximity to him. As such, Francis is indeed the vector of this devastating disease that manifests itself in certain uncertainty. Ambiguity, we must understand, is the very first symptom, stating nothing with unimpeachable certainty, and never in unambiguous terms that possess the insolence of exactitude. That is to say, absolute certainty is the first organ infected. It then advances through meaningless neologisms which sound meaningful to the unindoctrinated, until they are rationally examined by uninfected minds and reveal themselves as so much drivel or unembellished nonsense. But let us allow Francis, a heretic, a modernist, and the apex of evil in the Vatican, to prove our point. I quote 3 of his, let us say, paradigms. A first principle for progress in building a people is time is greater than space. The other is space hardens processes. The third is spaces and power are preferred to time and processes. Unless you are the keeper of or an inhabitant within an insane asylum, such analects of Chairman Francis would be impossible to pass in rational terms, let alone attain to something meaningful, or for that matter, remotely coherent. Once this ambitious policy of ambiguity and uncertainty infests the offices and bookshelves of every seminary rector, every pseudo-scholar, and all the carefully groomed future priests in virtually every Catholic seminary, it virtually suppresses and then ruthlessly expunges the 2,000-year patrimony and the indefeasible competency of the quite certain magisterium of 2,000 years, together with the equally certain sacred deposit of faith and holy tradition, which it contemptuously disdains. It strives to replace all 3 with spurious and meretricious parodies, none of which possess certainty. There is a desperate, decisive, and crucial need to return to sanity, and with sanity, certainty, through a complete reversion of all things to what is and ever was genuinely and unapologetically Catholic. This entails everything that has been blighted or obliterated since Vatican II, most especially a specifically sacred and universal language crafted for divine worship, Latin, which is unchanging and unchangeable, and hence in no need of meaningless improvisations, no geographical cultural inflections. It is a language that, for 2 millennia, was not confined to time and place. It transcended all geographical borders, all cultures, and every age, attaining to universality in a way that no other language ever accomplished. This return to sanity must embrace all that has been corrupted, everything religious, liturgical, intellectual, devotional, musical, every rubric, every response, everything must be restored to the 2,000-year-old form preceding the sacrilege of Vatican II. Apart from this total return, we remain a church without reason in both its meanings, a church that is irrational and a church without purpose. This cannot be achieved by schism from, but reversion to the one true Holy Catholic Church of our forebears for 2 millennia, and apart from which, as the Church had consistently and tenaciously held until Vatican II, there is no salvation. She is the body of Christ, of which he is the head, and there is no other name, or god, or goddess, or pagan idol, by which we are saved, as we read in the Acts of the Apostles, except Jesus Christ. Our hotbed homosexual seminaries, rectors, liberal and disaffected teachers, our carefully groomed pederast, pedophile, and predatory priests must first be immediately and unceremoniously thrown out, and the buildings they partied in and co-occupied thoroughly fumigated from the sexual filth that has found fertile ground there as a bacterium in a petri dish. Priests and seminarians must be reassessed and reformed in stringently Catholic terms that tolerate no aberration. The spectacle of feminist theologians, both female and male, instructing Catholic men on how to become priests must be put to an end and never allowed to experimentally emerge again. This is madness. Manly, unapologetic men should be examples in the classrooms and elsewhere to forge men for a manly task. The priesthood is nothing less. Virtually every aspect of genuine historical Catholicism has been thrown under the feet of modernists. The avant-garde, that is to say, the increasingly Protestant cardinals, bishops, theologians, and liturgists, together with the ever-experimental priests incarnated by homosexual predators who have created and maintained an impenetrable network of homosexual advocates both inside and outside the Church. We must remember Christ's admonition: do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Every traditional Catholic understands the force behind this admonition. It is not simply marginalization, exclusion, and ridicule, but open hostility. Calvinists, Lutherans, animists, atheists, and pagans are much more likely to encounter a warm and welcoming reception from progressives in the Church than a traditional Catholic. Why? Because traditional Catholics possess a certainty in their faith, a passionate belief in the tenets, doctrines, and dogmas that have forever been part of the very fabric of a Catholic life. A consuming faith that is largely foreign to their progressive counterparts. And central to that certainty is Jesus Christ, who is largely ignored in ecumenical gatherings as an impediment to Francis's program of accompaniment with all men and all gods and under all conditions. Christ sometimes spoke analogically, but for the most part, he spoke with forceful clarity, unmitigated austerity, and with absolute unambiguity. There was no misunderstanding Christ, or St. Peter, St. Paul, St. John, any of the apostles. No effort was made to accommodate the sensitivities of men, or to mitigate the antagonism of the world. As St. Peter succinctly stated, regardless of consequence, I quote, "We ought to obey God rather than men." That's in Acts of the Apostles. The corruption, estrangement, and ultimately the rescission of central aspects of Catholicism by Vatican II to accommodate non-Catholic denominations, Lutheranism in particular, Protestantism at large, and increasingly other pagan practices that it accepts under the most obscene notion of religion, must not only be recognized and confronted, it must be countered. It must be challenged actively in the tribunal of reason and demonstrated to be wanting. Contradictions cannot be politely put aside to accommodate consensus. The very notion of contradiction denotes conflict and disagreement. We must remember that the Church has consistently taught and maintained that the relationship between faith and reason is both mutual and reciprocal, not contradictory. It is both doxastic and evidentiary, and so understood the one involves the other. Reason and faith are not exclusionary. It is on these grounds, and they are certain grounds, upon which we can rely, that the documents and propositions, however much subversively presented as practical in nature, that issued from the Vatican should be decided. If they do not accord with reason, and most especially the law of non-contradiction, then neither are they consistent with faith, specifically the Catholic faith. We must soberly ask, do they accord with the mens ecclesiae, the mind of the Church, distilled and meticulously articulated through the 2,000 years preceding the Council? A council which has sought not just to mitigate the stringency of those teachings, but to abolish many of them. Consider, for example, Nostra Aetate, otherwise known as the Declaration on the Relation of the Church with Non-Christian Religions, and Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, which seeks the engagement of the Church in the world through a pastoral activism, much along the lines of the social and political activism that became prominent in the 1960s and 1970s. No longer obsessed with issues eternal, such as the salvation of souls, she was called away from them by Gaudium et Spes to what it deemed more immediate and practical issues concerning the social and political dimensions of man, to the end of improving the secular world, now firmly in her embrace. We would do well to pause here and to remember that these documents are not dogma, which by definition is irreformable or unable to be changed. Since nothing infallible accrues to these teachings, then they are indeed subject to rational criteria, as all the teachings of the Church have ever been, and competent to stand before the tribunal of reason. We must then ask, do these documents accord with the canons of reason, such that no contradiction is implied between these documents and the constant teaching of the Church prior to Vatican II? If no contradiction obtains, then the Council had done well. If not, and contradictions exist, then they must be reconciled, or failing that, be abandoned. But where we must ask, could such a forum be convened? Rome, of course. And convoked by whom? A pope, of course. Which effectively means that such a convocation will not likely occur within the lifetime of any present cardinal created by Francis or either of his two predecessors. They have been too thoroughly indoctrinated with Ecumenism to make such a leap into reason and logic. For this reason, it is vital for us in the meanwhile to find a traditional Catholic Church where the holy sacrifice of the Mass is celebrated in Latin and according to the long-established rubrics prior to 1962, and the outrage that the Post-Catholic-Conciliar-church imposed upon us and our children. Wherever the Latin Mass is celebrated, it is an outpost of sanity in a wilderness of ecclesiastical and liturgical madness. In a very practical aside, when we support our Novus Ordo Church, or when we donate to every diocesan plea for money, we must recognize that we are paying in large part for the exorbitant fees of lawyers hired by the diocese to settle lawsuits against homosexual predator priests. Entire dioceses, many around the country, have been bankrupted as a result of homosexual clerical abuse that has been, despite all the empty rhetoric, winked at and allowed to run rampant and unchecked by Francis and virtually every bishop in every diocesan chancery. In all this, am I being dismissive of Novus Ordo Catholics? No. The great majority of them do not know, for they were never taught, the most basic concepts and tenets of their genuine Catholic faith. Many of them, if not most of them, received a mere simulacrum of it, a shallow imitation of it, and the blame lay squarely on the narrow shoulders of their bishops, who never exercised oversight or authority over their priests, and on their priests who never assured the proper catechesis of their flocks, leaving that tiresome and tedious task to unvetted, unqualified, and largely ignorant CCD instructors. Let us be frank. For the past 60 years, catechesis essentially has been crayons and insipid but expensive glossy books with not so much as a crease in their covers. As a result, most Catholic masses remain effectively Protestant in tenor. Presentation, architecture, statuary, modernist stained glass, Marty Hogan, who was not a Catholic, music, and I'm okay, you're okay homilies geared to the brainless. This is not to impugn the piety of the aging congregation who, in the absence of proper and authentic catechesis, never took the time to examine the unimpeachable credentials of their own religion, or even its differentiation from every other religion. Despite the ignorance, understood in its actual definition as a lack of knowledge and absence of information, of doctrine and dogma that we almost universally encounter in the post-Vatican II Church, it is vital to us as traditional Catholics, cleaving to the faith for which the martyrs and saints bled and died, to remember that we should be paradigms of humility, keenly aware of our own abject state before God, recalling the admonishment of St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 9:27, that we be aware of any presumption of holiness within us. I quote, lest perhaps, when we have preached to others, we ourselves should become lost. But we must not and will not call evil good, nor good evil, however much we are called to do so by those who should be calling us away from every scandal of sin, but do not. For we must not and will not compromise with deceit, crucifying truth anew. Custodia te Deus.